Hi, so in this video, we are going to talk about 5 different stats that reveal the modern man's shadow. My name is Christopher. I'm a therapist who works with men. And to start off today's video, I want to just share a little quotation that I think sheds some light on what we're talking about here. This quotation comes from a counselor's name is John Eldredge. He's also written quite a few books as well. He says, "Men are not afraid of dying. They're afraid of being seen." And I think that really sort of speaks to the core of what we're going to be talking about here in today's video. And when we talk about the word the shadow, I want to get clear on what that means. So the shadow is an idea, a concept of the human psyche that was coined by the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. And basically what the shadow is all of the repressed parts of ourselves that we don't have access to. One common misconception about the shadow is that the shadow is somehow evil or bad. And this isn't necessarily true. Parts of who we are that are full of light and perhaps even joy can end up in the shadow. Basically, how the shadow forms is all of the parts that become rejected by society, by our parents, by teachers, by our friends, anything about us that we feel ashamed about or isn't okay, that we don't feel is okay to show to other people, ends up going into the shadow. And so what ends up happening is a bunch of elements of who we are get cut off. Now, when they get cut off from who we are and who we present ourselves, the image that we present ourselves to the world, these parts don't go away. They end up acting themselves out unconsciously through unhealthy behavior mechanisms. Robert Bly, a poet who really led the mythopoetic men's movement in the late 20th century, has talked about how when we repress something, when we cut something off from who we are, that part doesn't just go away, it actually regresses, which is a term that means it actually gets a little bit more infantile, and so it doesn't actually grow. So we may have these parts that we've left off inside of ourselves ages 2, 3, 4, 5, where we start cutting ourselves off from who we are so that we can appear to fit into society's terms. Now, this is a natural progression of evolutionary growth. It's a natural progression of the psychological development. However, part of our responsibility as an adult is to now go back to these parts and places that we rejected from ourselves and to reintegrate these. Now, the shadow can show up in individuals as a individual shadow. Each of us have our own shadows, and the shadow can also show up in a collective sense. An entire nation can have a shadow, an entire group of people can have a shadow, an organization can have a shadow, parts that are not shown, that aren't seen to the world. And what we're essentially talking about here in this video are sort of the ideas around the collective shadow that perhaps we as men face together during this time of human history. So one of these stats that I think is really important for us to understand is that currently today, 1 in 3 men report feeling lonely. So on the positive side, 2/3 of men aren't reporting this, but to also understand that a third of men out there, 83%, 1 of every 3 men feeling lonely, that's a pretty significant amount of men. And essentially what we're talking about here when we're talking about loneliness isn't necessarily just not being around people. I know for myself personally, I got my undergraduate degree in Chicago, and I remember being surrounded by millions of people, yet I still felt lonely. I lived in an apartment with other people, and I still felt lonely. So it doesn't have anything to do with physical proximity of being around other people. For me, loneliness really developed just not having a connection, a deep connection with other individuals in my life. When I'm not able to share who I am with other people, I start feeling lonely. And so it has nothing to do with hanging out with people or being around other people. It has to do with the depth and quality of relationships that we surround ourselves with. And I know for us as men, we typically are conditioned not to connect with each other on deep levels. There's many reasons for this. However, it's important to understand that loneliness isn't about physical proximity, it's about the depth and richness of connection with others. Another important piece here is that feeling lonely isn't a sign of weakness. It's not something to eradicate. It's a natural emotional response. And all it means is that we're seeking connection in some way. And when we talk about this, obviously, we're talking about depth of relationship with others, and we're also talking about depth of relationship to ourselves. when we start progressing on the path, whether it's spiritual or psychological or self-development, whatever you want to call it, we start entering through various stages. And one of these stages begins to shift when we start moving from feeling loneliness to feeling a sense of solitude and reprieve when we're alone. And so obviously you can be alone and not feel lonely. So obviously this has to do with some sort of internal process that's going on inside of us. So what we're talking about here is the difference between being in solitude, seeking out time where we can be alone and connect with ourselves, and then times when we're feeling lonely. A progression on the spiritual path is recognizing, then knocking the mic here, is when we can start feeling solitude when we're by ourselves and not feeling the loneliness. And once again, loneliness isn't a failure. It doesn't mean anything's wrong. It's just our body's way of letting us know that we have a need and it's okay to go and want to connect with people. Another stat somewhat similar to this one is that currently 1 in 5 single men report that they have no close friends. And I think that that's pretty significant as well. Obviously, 4 out of 5 men report having close friends, which is incredible. However, 20% of our men still out there are not connecting in a super deep way with other people. And I think that that's extremely significant to understand. Once again, I think that we as men don't really have a whole lot of natural spaces where being vulnerable with other men is accepted. I know for myself personally, I've had to go and seek it out, whether through therapy groups or men's groups. I've had to go and find spaces where men are actually being vulnerable and emotionally connected with each other. Obviously, this has to do with, once again, our society's sort of conception on what it is supposed to be, who we are supposed to be as men. And if society rejects this idea that we're supposed to be able to be connected and vulnerable and emotional even with other men, then we lack an ability to connect with other men. I think this also comes because we don't also have connection with older men or younger men typically. Usually the men that we have in our lives are in our same generation. And that can be problematic, right? Because we can rely on, the wisdom of people who have come before us, and we can also pass on our own and connect with others. To have brothers both older and younger than us, to have uncles and cousins, metaphorically speaking here, that aren't necessarily blood related, so that we can connect with men of different generations as well. That's definitely something that we've lost, that our ancestors had access to. When they were in the tribe, they were consistently surrounded by other men. Your grandfather didn't live out down in Florida in a retirement home. He was a part of the village. He's probably helping making decisions towards, different affairs and things going on. So you could see how they were interacting, and you had all the different generations of wisdom there to help you develop. And today we've lost that aspect. And so I think we've also lost an ability to connect with men, not just within our own, generation, but even generations above and below us as well. Another significant stat here is that men die by suicide nearly 4 times more than women. That comes from the CDC in 2022. And that's extremely significant. There are a lot of different reasons for this. This is not to knock the suffering that women go through as well. However, there is something going on when in our culture we have men committing suicide at 4 times the rate as their female counterparts. And essentially, a couple reasons, go through this. One of the most significant reasons is that men are most likely to follow through with suicide. They're most likely to choose more violent or decisive suicidal events that can actually take their life. And also, men are less likely to talk about their emotional pain. I think that that's one of the deepest sort of core wounds. And one of the reasons why men go through the suicide process is because there's nowhere that they feel that they can turn to relieve or to speak about. And with suicide, there's many different conflicting emotions and grief and shame and rage. And when we as men don't have places where we can work through some of this stuff, we usually end up attacking ourselves with a lot of this energy. And ultimately, the body's attempt at trying to resolve and work through some of these emotions end up, maybe taking someone's own life when the mind attaches itself to something that needs to go. This really just has to do with this idea that we as men don't have typically safe spaces to go and to talk about things, to be able to express and to just check in to see what's going on within ourselves, a place of self exploration. Once again, we can come back to the idea of the shadow as well. These parts of ourselves that have been rejected that are asking for us to see them, to love them, to understand them. And when we consistently reject that, and this isn't a conscious process, this is happening at the unconscious level, and it requires sometimes help from others to help see these parts of ourselves. Another significant stat here that I think also plays into the suicide is that only 1 in 3 men who are struggling with mental health seek help, meaning that 2/3 of men are currently doing what they can on their own. And typically what this means is unhealthy coping mechanisms resulting to pornography, some other forms of addiction, whether it be drug, alcohol related, could be sexual addiction, food, gambling, adrenaline, whatever the particular addiction may be. A lot of men turn to these things as a way to self-soothe, as a way to cope, as opposed to turning towards help and seeking help from other people, because once again, in our society, asking for help has been deemed a form of weakness in men. And we can begin to change this narrative by taking action, by reaching out, by finding a safe and supportive place where we can start expressing these things. Because what we're essentially doing here is rewriting the cultural narrative. We have an opportunity here to change what our ancestors have asked for us to change. What we've had in the past has been created mainly due to survival mechanisms, and we now live in an incredible time where we can begin, perhaps for some of the first times in human history, to really start opening up and understanding what's going on inside of us at this fundamental level beyond just the need for daily survival. Once again, there's also a stigma around men seeking therapy. Therapy is usually viewed as some kind of weakness or as a failure of oneself, as opposed to something that takes a tremendous amount of courage to reach out to do. I think, quite honestly, it takes so much more courage to ask for help. It takes so much more courage to go in to face the shadow. It takes so much more courage to go and to feel our emotions than it does to just stay isolated and stuck and closed off to the world. It's a lot easier to stay in our comfortable shell, not opening up to anybody. It takes courage and strength. It takes a warrior to be able to open themselves up to another person in a safe space. And the fifth stat here, which is extremely significant, so a little controversial for myself, but over 60% of men have experienced at least one traumatic event. That comes from the National Center for PTSD in a study they did in 2020. However, I would go as far as to say that every single human being has trauma. We've all experienced trauma. And what I mean by trauma isn't necessarily some big catastrophic event. It doesn't have to be war or a car wreck or somebody dying in our life. It doesn't have to be these big, huge events. It can be something a lot more subtle. The way that I define trauma is anything that is too taxing or stressing for our nervous system to regulate. And this can happen very early on in adolescence. When we're children, we really do require our parents in order to survive. We don't have the ability to fend or to take care of ourselves. So if there's some sort of like emotional disruption that happens early on in childhood, our safety and our sense of security is threatened, and that can be traumatic to a little child. Even early stage of infancy, ages 0 to 2, as babies in cribs, when we're not able to move and we have a need and we're crying out for the mother, and she turns her gaze away, not necessarily out of a form of rejection, but maybe she's handling other children or she has something else to do, or maybe she's just a little tired and doesn't want to come over to us at this very moment, then our nervous system takes that on as, oh my gosh, we're going to die. And so that moment is traumatic to the infant. And what happens is that energy gets stuck inside of the body. It doesn't process, and it also develops a sense of perception about oneself in the world that if mom turns away, then I must not be important, right? And this isn't a conscious process. It's a process that happens internally through the baby. So ages 0 to 10, when we're really developing, are extremely important and crucial for getting safe and healthy connections. And if we didn't get that, then, we most likely have some kind of wounding here. And once again, I would go as far as to say that every single one of us carries wounds, not even just from our own source of development in our individual lives, but I would go as far as to say that we even carry wounds from our ancestors, that when they are unable to resolve or work through, some of the energy gets stored in the DNA and passed down generation to generation. So we're talking about generational, we're talking about ancestral trauma here too, that we all carry that. And just being in our society today, we have conditioning, we have trauma from a capitalistic sort of dominated culture. Once again, I'm not, narking on capitalism, but I am saying that, there is a certain demand here that when we focus on maximizing shareholder value, that degrades the human experience in some way, that we all experience some form of trauma just being in our society today there's a conditioning that we all have about a sense of self-worth, about who we are, how we show up in the world. All of these factor into trauma. And quite honestly, what ends up happening with trauma, if we don't resolve it, is once again, this goes into the shadow. A lot of shame can develop, anger, rage. And when we have trauma, typically what we see as conscious manifestations are addiction, codependency, anger, suicide, different forms of ways that we interact with the world in that are, unhealthy. So that those unhealthy behavior mechanisms directly relate to traumatic experience that we have. If we have a feeling of not feeling good enough, of not feeling whole, of not feeling complete, a feeling of being on edge, anxiety, or depression, these are all signs that in some way your nervous system has been conditioned that you are not in a safe place. And what this means is that we need to start working through this. And essentially, that's what shadow work is starting to unpeel the unconscious to understand what has happened to us, what's happened to our ancestors, how can we start working through this? And a couple of practical ways that you can start working on this is first and foremost, getting very curious about your dreams. Dreams are not just some weird phenomena. We spend a third of our lives in sleep, and to think that during that time there's nothing productive that's happening for the nervous system and the psyche is just bonkers. We've lost touch with the ability as a culture to recognize the language that our dreams have to tell us. And we can get back into communication with that. One good way to start doing that is just by recording your dreams in a journal. If you're one of those people who says that you don't dream, once you start paying attention to your unconscious, it will start helping you. Once we begin to start paying attention to it, every single person dreams. If we go to bed drunk or high each night or taking some form of medication, sometimes we're not able to access that fourth cycle of REM sleep. Which is typically where we dream in that deep sleep. And so one way that you could start perhaps producing some dreams is to stop using substances to help to fall asleep naturally. And even if it's difficult at first, you'll retrain your body to start doing it, but then you'll have access to your dreams again. And one recommendation is just one of the first things in the morning, wake up, have your journal by the bed, and write some things down. If you wake up in the middle of the night, maybe write one or two words down to help recall the dream and the memory. And getting curious about these dreams, you can then bring them into a session with a therapist or even your own work. Or sometimes what I'll do as well is even just work with like AI, like ChatGPT or whatever AI software you use to help understand the dream a little bit better. Another great way to start doing this work is to start working with a therapist. Like I mentioned, to have the courage to start opening up to another individual in a safe space, finding a men's group or whatever feels comfortable for you to partake in right now. There are plenty of resources out there. If you are looking for somebody who specializes in this kind of work, I am currently taking on clients. If you're looking for shadow work or doing some of the deeper men's work, feel free to reach out. I'm here to help support you. You can actually click the link down in the description below, and you can schedule a free call with me. We can just talk to see if it's a good fit. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.